Hi, welcome to this section where we will be learning how to do the color correction and grading of your shots. So we will explore the power of Resolve when it comes to coloring the videos. Also, this is the latest version of Davinci Resolve, which is Davinci Resolve version 15. If you're using a different version, the interface might look slightly different, but any such difference would be just in the interface. The working is exactly the same. So this is how the color workspace in Davinci Resolve looks like, and here we can do all the work related to coloring. And frankly, it may seem daunting at first, but it's actually quite straightforward and really fun to use once you get used to it. So first of all, we need to add some clips in order to work on them. So if I go to the media pool in the color workspace, you can see that there are no clips added yet. So in order to do that, I will go to the media workspace, navigate to my clips that I want to color grade or color correct, then select them and drop them to the media pool. So again, it will ask for the frame rate. I will say change, and it's added to the media pool. Now I can go to the edit workspace, and here I have to pick both of these or any number of clips that you are going to work on and drop them to the timeline. Only then can we work on those clips in the color workspace. So now if I go to the color workspace, you can see that these clips have been added to the media pool, and now we can work on them. So I can turn off the media pool, and now you can see here, this area is basically the program monitor, which will give you the preview of how your final video would look like after color correction and grading. At the top, we have different tabs, like we can see our gallery. There's nothing in that right now. The LUTs or lookup tables, media pool to see the footage and clips, and the timeline to see your clips and scrub through them. And all of these tabs are basically toggle buttons. So I can turn off the timeline by pressing it again. I can turn off the media pool by pressing it, and all of these are off. If I want to turn any of these on, I just need to press it once more and it will be on. And on the right, we have this tab for clips. So if I turn it on, it shows the clips, all the clips I have, but it will reduce the size of your preview. So if I don't want to look at the clips right now, I can just turn them on, turn them off to have a bigger preview. Then we have this thing called nodes that we'll be exploring later in this section. And if I turn it on, this is how it looks like. And it will again reduce the size of your preview. But if I don't want to look at the nodes, I can turn them off to have a bigger preview. Then we have OpenFX, and in the end, we have the light box that will show you all your shots. So from all these tabs, you can turn off the tabs that you don't need, and that will resize the preview window, and that will slightly change the interface. For example, this is how it would look like when all these tabs are off. If I turn on the timeline, it will bring a timeline under the preview, and that will actually reduce the size of the preview. This is how it would look like when everything is off. If I again turn on the nodes, it will reduce the size of the preview. And if I turn nodes and timeline, both of them on, this is how it would look like. So for beginners, I think here it would be a good idea to pause this lesson right now and play around with turning on and off these tabs and see how the size of different windows and the look of your overall interface changes, so that you can become comfortable with the environment. And down here in this area, we have these color wheels, and there are more tools for coloring above these color wheels and below these color wheels. So we'll be using them a lot later in the course. Then on the right, we have this window, and the look of this window basically depends on which of these three buttons are selected. So let's start with this I. This is for information, and it basically shows the information about the frame rate or resolution of your selected clip. Then the next one is scopes. And these scopes are extremely important when it comes to color correction and color grading, and we will be using them a lot throughout this process. And there are actually 4 different types of scopes, and you can pick any of them from this drop-down menu. So we have parade, we have waveform, vector scope, and histogram. So later in the course, we will see what each of them does and how we can use them to effectively color correct and grade. And the last one is keyframes. This is to work with keyframes for color adjustment. Here you can animate different things and set keyframes on different parts of your clips. These keyframes work exactly like in most other applications. So that's the interface of the color workspace in Davinci Resolve. I know it might be a little overwhelming for beginners, but don't worry, you will get used to it by the end of the course. Thanks for watching. Hi and welcome. In this lesson, we will learn the working of color wheels and all the tools in this region. So here in the color wheels, we have lift, gamma, and gain. Think of them as shadows, midtones, and highlights. In the color world, this is the terminology that we use. So in all of these color wheels, the default position of this little circle is going to be in the exact center of the wheel, and we can drag it towards either of these colors. The first wheel is for lift, and it is basically related to the darker parts or shadows in the image. So you see the default position of this little circle is in the center. So right now this wheel is neutral. And if I click here and drag it towards the red color, it basically pushes the red color in the shadows. Although the remaining portions of the image are in the waveform, they are also affected, but mostly it affects the shadows. And if I want to reset it to its original value, there is a little arrow on top of each of these wheels, so I can press it, and that way I can reset it to its original value. The next wheel is for gamma, and with that we can basically introduce specific colors into the midtones. Then we have the gain wheel, which is related to the highlights or the brighter parts of the image. So if I pull it towards the red, pull it towards the blue color, you will see that the blue color is pushed into the highlights, and here you can also see that the brighter parts become bluish, especially this sky. Without this was pretty flat, but by increasing the blue color, it basically pushes more blue into the highlights, especially the sky, and the other parts of the image are not affected that much. I'll reset that. So these 3 wheels, these basically affect different portions of the image. Lift is related to shadows, gamma is related to the midtones, gain is related to the highlights. But then we have the 4th wheel, which is for the offset. So this wheel affects the whole image equally. And if I make it red, you will see that all parts become reddish. Unlike if I pulled the lift wheel towards red, it will have a different effect compared to if I did that in the offset wheel. So these wheels give you a lot of options to control the look of your clips. If you change the value of one of these wheels and you want to reset that, you can just click the reset button on top of that particular wheel. But if you made a lot of changes and you just want to reset all of them in one click, then on the top there is this global reset button. And for example, let me do a couple of changes here. And you can see that I can reset all of these changes by pressing this global reset button. So to summarize all of that, these color wheels affect the hue and saturation of the shadows for this wheel, midtones for this wheel, and highlights for this wheel, and then the overall image for this last offset wheel. The direction of dragging of this little circle is used to pick a particular hue, For example, I can drag it towards the red and red color is selected. After that color is picked, the more we pull it away from the center, the higher the saturation level for that particular area of the image. Then under each of these wheels, you will see a slider wheel. So these wheels affect the brightness or luminosity for the respected part of the image. So this changes luminosity for shadows. This does that for the midtones. This does that for the highlights. And this slider does that for the overall image. So turning this wheel around is like increasing the values of red, green, and blue channels equally, unlike moving around this point, which changes them unequally. So by clicking on this wheel and dragging it towards the right, increases the brightness for the shadows, and moving it towards the left decreases the brightness. The values of red, green, and blue channels are shown under each of the wheels. So I can move the lift slider to the left side to make the shadows darker, and that way I can increase the contrast. So if you play around with them for a little bit, you can get the hang of them. Another cool thing is that above the gain wheel, there is a crosshair with a white point next to that. And if you click that, you can pick your white point in the image. So you can click on a color that you want to appear white. For example, let's say I want to click on this cap, which although isn't really white, but just for the sake of this example, let me click here. And it will adjust the brightness, hue, and saturation of that color to white, and it will adjust everything else in the image accordingly. Now this is a little bit too much, so I will just reset that, and let's go to another clip, and here we have this white color. So let's do that again. I'll click here and now bring my cursor over these white circles. Click here and it will adjust the hue, saturation, and brightness to have this color look pure white. Similarly, above the lift wheel, you will see another crosshair with the black dot next to that if you look very carefully. So I can click it, and now I have to click somewhere in the image where I want the color to appear black. I can click here and you will see that now this is pure black and everything has been adjusted in terms of hue, saturation, and brightness so that it looks pure white. But do keep in mind that such automatic adjustments are not always great, as you can see here. But the good thing is you can use them as a starting point to make further adjustments in order to give a particular look to your clip. So I will reset that. And now let's look at the different types of color wheels we have. So basically there are 3 sets of color wheels in Davinci Resolve. This is the first set, and this is called primary wheels. Okay. And if you look closely, there are 3 dots here. So the first one is highlighted and that shows primary wheels. If I click on the next dot, it has primary bars. And then the last one is logs. Okay, so these are the 3 different sets of wheels. And I can also access them using this drop down menu. So these are primary wheels, these are primary bars, and then we have logs. So the first 2 types, both of them have the word primary in them, so collectively we can call them primaries. And the working of primary wheels and primary bars is exactly the same except for their different user interface. So this is how primary wheels look like, and this is how primary bars look like. Of course, these are not wheels. This is just the difference in their interface. Their working is exactly the same, as we will see shortly. So the benefit of primary bars is that for each of the portions, whether it's lift, gamma, gain, or offset, here we can play around with the red, green, and blue channels in each of the portions individually, unlike in primary wheels where we have lesser control over changing individual colors. Logs are totally different in terms of their working compared to both of the primaries. So now let's look at each of these sets of wheels one by one. So the first set of wheels is called primary wheels, and these affect a bigger portion of the waveform and are not very specific about which portions receive the effects being applied. For example, if I apply a color effect on the highlights, it will of course affect the highlights, but some of that effect will also go to the midtones as well as to the shadows area. So to illustrate that, let me look at the other clip, which is kind of dark, and here I think it would be easier to explain the working of these primary wheels. If I increase its offset, so here you can see that this waveform has a gap at the top throughout the waveform, and we can fill this gap by adjusting the gain. I can use this slider wheel in the gain. So by clicking it with my mouse and dragging it to the right, you can see that the waveform is spreading because I am increasing its gain. Although this should affect the highlights in a stronger way, but it is also having some effect in the midtones as well as in the shadows area. If I do it again, you see that it has a very strong effect in the highlights where its effect should go, but it also has some effect in the midtones as well as in the shadows. Then if I make some adjustments to the gamma wheel, this should have a direct impact on the midtones, but as you see, it also affects the highlights as well as the shadows. So the effect of each of these wheels is not only restricted to their intended target regions, but it also spreads to the surrounding regions. So the gamma not only affects the midtones, but it also has some effect going towards the highlights as well as to the shadows. Similarly, if I decrease the lift, you see that it has a stronger impact on the shadows, but it also has some effect going to the midtones as well as even to the highlights. So you can see that all these wheels, these not only affect their intended regions, but also have their effect extending to the surrounding regions as well. Then lastly, we have the offset wheel, and by changing that, it doesn't affect a certain region, it affects all of the regions equally, unlike all these other wheels. So by increasing it, I can shift my whole waveform upwards, and by decreasing it, I can shift it downwards. So these are the primary wheels, and these work in bigger strokes and affect a larger portion of the waveform, as we just saw. The next set is the primary bars. The primary bars are identical to color wheels, just represented a bit differently. And sometimes it becomes easier depending on what it is that you're trying to do. So in order to illustrate the working of these primary bars, let's assume for a moment that we had a shot that we were working on and it has a lot of green in that. So let me, in the primary wheels, let me pull gamma towards very dark green color. And do keep in mind this position of this gamma wheel. Now, we can pull out this green color in the primary bars. So in the gamma section, I can pull down the green. And now if I go to the primary wheels, you can see that, remember, the original position of this gamma wheel was here, but it has basically pulled away from the green color and it is shifted more towards the magenta. So now if I go to the primary bars and reset the gamma, you will see that it also resets in the primary wheels. So this clarifies that the primary wheels and primary bars, both of them work together, and whatever we do in one reflects in the other. Let's do one more example to further clarify this point. So right now you see that in the gamma section, all these red, green and blue channels, these have their values close to 0. Now if I go to the primary wheels and if I increase the value of gamma, you will see that the values in the red, green and blue channels, all of them increase equally. But if I reset it and now if I tilt it more towards the red color, same thing happens in the bars. Red channel increases in value and the other channels adjust accordingly. I hope that's clear. So I can reset that. And the last set is the log wheels, and these wheels are more specific. For example, if you change midtones, it will affect just the midtones and it will have very little to no effect on the surrounding regions. And you can use these two values, LR is for low range, and HR is for high range. So you can use these low range and high range values to define if the effect extends into the neighboring regions or not. So to illustrate this point, let me just go to primary wheels for a little bit and let me extend this waveform so that I can explain my point more clearly. So let's say this is the waveform we are working with. So now if I change the values of shadows, you see that it is only affecting the bottom of the waveform or shadows. As I change this value, you will see that the shadows are decreasing and eventually they start clipping. Right now you see the value of this low range is 0.333. Now I can further control that how much the turning of this wheel affects these shadows. I can further control that by changing this value of low range. So if I decrease it, let's say to 0.15, and now turn this wheel, now it will affect even a smaller portion of the shadows. You can see that only a very small portion of the shadows is shifting as I turn this wheel. See? Similarly, if I want to have a much bigger impact on the shadows by turning this wheel, I can make this increase it to a higher value, and now just a little bit of turning of this wheel would have a bigger impact on the shadows. And still you see that this is very specific to shadows. It is not affecting midtones or highlights at all. All it is affecting is the shadows. And I can further control how much of the shadows are being affected. And if I further reduce it to 0, turning this wheel does not have any effect on the shadows. So this definitely gives us more control to affect particular portions of the waveform in a more precise way. Similarly, I can make changes to only the highlights by turning this wheel. And now you see that as I turn this wheel, only the highlights are being affected and the midtones and shadows, they don't have any effect at all. And even for the highlights, I can be very specific about how much of the highlights are affected. So right now the higher range is 0.55, so it is affecting a bigger portion of the highlights. I can make it even bigger by decreasing this higher range, and now it starts even affecting the midtones as well. But I can make this higher range closer to 1, and it will start having lesser and lesser effect on the highlights. You see the effect has decreased. If I increase it more, now the effect would be even smaller. Further increase it, and now the effect would be negligible. It is now barely affecting the highlights, and when it is exactly 1, it stops affecting even the highlights. So by changing this high range value, I can adjust even the tiniest parts of the waveform. So with log wheels, you can be very specific about fine-tuning things and where the adjustments take place. So that's how these color wheels work. Now I'll go ahead and reset all of them. Then under these color wheels, we have a few more controls. So you see this number 1 and 2. So if you press 1, this is the menu and it has a few different controls. And if you press 2, this brings up a few more controls. How do you change these values? You just click on one of these values, click here, then hold it. And now if you drag your mouse towards the right, the value increases. If you drag it towards the left, the value decreases. Okay. And if you just want to reset it, you just double click on the text label and that resets it to the original or default value. So now let's look at each of these controls. The first one is contrast. This basically pulls everything apart and makes your image more contrasty. So this is the original waveform and you can see that it is not taking the entire vertical space. So as I hold it and drag it to the right, the contrast increases. It basically pulls this waveform apart. So the highlights are pulled upwards and shadows are pulled downwards so that it takes more vertical space. You can also look at the image and now it has become much more contrastier. Although that's kind of an overkill, but just giving you the idea. Now if I want to reset that, just double click it. The next one is pivot. And with this parameter at the default value, stretching will occur evenly on both sides. Right now, pivot is at the default value. So if I increase or decrease the contrast, you will see that this will basically stretch evenly around the center. You see, it is stretching around the center. If I increase the pivot value, let's say I make it 0.5, or let me make it 0.6 so that it's more off center. So now where is this pivot point occurring? 0.597 or 0.6 approximately. This is lying around somewhere here, okay, along this waveform. So with this pivot value, if I increase the contrast, the waveform will stretch around this value. So if I now increase the contrast, you see that it basically is stretching around this value. So although there's not much portion of the waveform above this, so stretching it basically is pulling almost whole waveform downwards. Let me just reset it and let me now for a moment, let me make this pivot point 0.3 and see what difference it makes. Or let me make it 0.2. So 0.2 is somewhere here. If I now increase the contrast, now this area of the waveform will be kind of stationary, and above that and below that it would be uneven stretching. So this is stretching, this is squeezing, and if you look closely, all of that stretching or squeezing is happening around this pivot point. So again, with this pivot point at the default value, the stretching would be even on both sides. But when you change it away from its default value, now the stretch would be uneven and the new pivot point will be the middle point around which stretching would occur. Let me reset both of these. The next parameter is saturation, and it is kind of self-explanatory. If I increase it, that increases the saturation in the image. If I decrease it, that desaturates it. So you can see in the waveform that when I desaturate it, all the red, green, and blue colors perfectly overlap, and this results in a black and white image. But as I increase it, you will see that the red, green, and blue colors start shifting away from each other, and that is where you start seeing the different colors. The higher the value of saturation, the more you see the color shifting from each other, and the more saturated the image looks. The next parameter is hue. So by increasing or decreasing it, we can give specific hues to our image. The last option is Luma Mix, but don't really worry about that because it's a bit more advanced for this course. So that was menu 1, and then there is menu 2 with a few more options. So the first option is temperature, and if I increase it to a positive value, I can make my image look warmer, and if I decrease it to a negative value, it appears cooler. So with that, I can adjust the temperature of my image. Then the next tool is tint, and with this you can shift colors up or down to give specific tints to your image from green all the way to magenta. The next one is MD, where MD stands for mid-tone detail. So this is going to add contrast to your midtones, and you can have them look sharper or blurrier. Then the next one is CB, where CB stands for color boost, and it saturates everything by giving it a color boost. The next tool is called shadows, and this is of course to adjust shadows. So if your video is too bright, you can adjust it to pull down the shadows. And the last tool is called HL, where HL is for highlights. So just like shadows, we can also play around with this to adjust our highlights. And with these tools, we can have our image look more balanced so that it's not really clippy on the upper or lower side. So I can go ahead and reset all of them. And one more important thing is that some of these options will change depending on whether you are looking at the primaries or logs. So for example, here in the logs, you have this option for low range and high range. Okay, so this option for low range and high range only appears under log wheels. If I go to primary wheels or primary bars, you won't see this low range or high range option under either menu 1 or 2. So just keep this in mind that some of these options might be different depending on which kind of wheels you're looking at. So these are mainly the tools we have for color adjustment, and I hope now you have a good understanding of how each of them works. I would further encourage you to play around with them to become more familiar and comfortable with them. Thanks for watching.